I'm very pleased, we as a department are very pleased to receive William Labov and Gillian Sankoff here this week. And it's my pleasant duty to introduce Bill. Bill Labov started late in linguistics. He was a late starter. He majored in English and philosophy at Harvard, first of all. And then, according to his website, what he explains is that he then became a blurb writer. Okay, he spent several years writing stuff for products of various sorts, I think. And he also says he wasn't very successful at this particular enterprise. So, the next thing he did was to draw on one of his other strengths, scientific strength maybe. He became an ink maker. He worked, I'm not entirely sure, he worked for printers, I guess. So he became a chemist, a research chemist essentially. And the sort of things he did was, in the days when we had silkscreen printing, he produced the ink for that, and he also produced ink for logos and things on t-shirts. This doesn't have very much to do with linguistics, except that he informs us that this benefited him in two ways. One was that he got to meet a wide variety of people in this particular job. And he listened to the way they spoke, he listened to their narratives, and he listened to other things as well. The second thing he got from this particular job was an appreciation of the scientific method, in other words, experimentation, measurement, accuracy, those sorts of things. Then, sometime in the early 60s, 1960 or 61 or thereabouts, he grew interested in linguistics. And his early studies took him to an island known as Martha's Vineyard, familiar to most people in this room, probably only through linguistics, not because I've actually been there. And what he noticed was that some of the vowel sounds appeared to vary in certain ways, and that the variation was somehow connected with what people felt about the island. Okay, there was a correlation between whether you said rate or right, and whether you enjoyed living on the island, something along those lines. So this then set him along asking the question, well, linguistics was a new topic, a new subject at that time, and it was relatively, well, he saw linguists arguing among themselves, okay, without going out to get some data. So he felt that this was really the way to do linguistics, and I think this is still be his view now. He went to New York City, as we all know. He went to Philadelphia, where he still is, and has been head of the linguistics laboratory since, I think, 1970. And so this is a center, a hotbed of empirical studies of dialect, language variation, American particularly language variation. And out of that grew, well, the three volumes of Principles of Linguistic Change, which some of you have seen. Also, the Atlas of North American English comes from his studies at the Linguistic Laboratory. Okay, he has two other strings to his bow, not just language variation. Narrative is a very major one, and I mentioned narrative earlier. Back in 1967, he wrote a seminal article, which many of us still refer to, on the structure of narrative by himself and Joshua Waletsky. So, okay, that's some years ago. In this very month, June 2013, he has published a book called The Language of Life and Death. Bill, has that book actually come out? Can we get it at the bookstores? Or on Amazon or something like that? Or is it still forthcoming? August, right, okay. Okay, August, right. So the website is a little bit out of date, not Bill's, but the publisher's website. So he's still engaged with this kind of thing. The other thing he is interested in is public service. Okay. Back in '72, he wrote an article called The Logic of Non-Standard English, which was the first really to show systematically something that we take for granted now, and that is that non-standard varieties of English are systematic in some way. And the subject of that was actually African American vernacular English. So this public engagement that he still has led him to his involvement in the Ann Arbor trials and the Oakland School District trials as well, in which he asserted, along with other linguists, that these varieties of language are systematic, self-contained varieties of language, rather than bad forms of English. Okay. But enough of that. Let us bring the story back to York. In the year 1998, Bill was awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of York. And I think, okay, he wasn't able to actually pick up the doctorate at that time. So we were thinking this is probably his first visit to York. So it is my extremely great pleasure to welcome William Labov.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. I would say that whatever I started has been carried further than I've done myself here in Britain, and particularly as we learned this morning at York. So that what I hope to add to what you already know is some thinking about some unsolved problems, the relation of social to structural factors, and the explanation of linguistic change. Over the course of time, I've oscillated back and forth between emphasizing the social motivation of sound change and structural explanations. What do I mean by structural factors? Such things as the principle of maximal dispersion, the tendency of vowels in a subsystem to be as distant from each other as they can be. And then there are principles about the unidirectional expansion of mergers, which we're going to see violated today. There are unidirectional patterns of chain shifting, which are not fully explained, but seem to be still valid. There's a tendency of nucleus and glide of diphthongs to become as different as possible. And perhaps most important is the tendency of people to generalize one part of their system to another and spread changes to parallel changes, and which affect whole systems. The social factors include formally acts of identity, in the sense of LePage's centered modes of accommodation in the way that Howard Giles has studied, and is what we'll look at today that is emphasized here, the relative status of regional dialects. So what we want to do is to say, okay, at what time do we explain linguistic change by this factor or that? And most recently I've been engaged in the study of the northern city shift around the Great Lakes, which is the most intricate and most complex set of linguistic changes that I know about. And I was so impressed by the structural factors that I once gave a talk at Los Angeles, LA, and I said, the structural factors here are so powerful and the social factors exist, but they're rather weak. And I lost half my friends on the spot. But now most recently I've been working in the Philadelphia area, finding any number of systematic changes which are difficult to explain by any structural factor without taking into account these social factors. And the relationship, it comes out much in my 2010 book. We talk about triggering events that lead to language change. And the triggering event that leads to extensive systematic change is the insertion or removal of a category from a subsystem in a direction determined by unidirectional constraints on linguistic change. The principle of maximal dispersion then applies within that subsystem as a driving force for continued change. And that's a general blueprint for the kinds of studies that are exemplified by the northern city shift. And I then said at that time, social linguistic variation is an opportunistic process that reinforces social distinctions by associating them with particular linguistic variants. The use of linguistic forms to increase distinctiveness of particular social groups may serve as a driving force for the acceleration of individual change. But social evaluation does not attach to systemic relations at a more abstract level. So social evaluation is pretty superficial. People don't see deeply into these structures when they operate on them. So at what level of linguistic structure are social values actually attached? So I've just sketched this out by drawing a line through phones and say, Sounds are never evaluated socially. Never, as far as I know. People say, I hate these ugly sounds. But what they mean is the use of a particular allophone in a particular phoneme. So, for example, in Philadelphia, people say there's this ugly sound of ia in beard. But they never say there's an ugly sound of ia in idea. It's not the sound itself, but the fact that instead of bad, people produce the ingliding diphthong ia. So it's not the phoneme that's evaluated or a phone, but something close to the surface. And similarly for stems. As far as I know, words are never evaluated socially. It's the stem, because you see this in the fact that, as I say here, the word piss is considered impolite and vulgar in piss, in pisses, and pissing, and pissing. And if you can imagine a language in which people say, oh, it's okay to say she pisses, but not to say we piss. So that the link between social evaluation and language structure is just below the surface. So as far as we know, and as far as we know up to today, mergers are rarely not reversed, not evaluated. Splits, we'll talk about the Philadelphia split between bad and bad, are not evaluated. Chain shifts are not evaluated. People never have a social reaction to the social impact of 5 vowels rotating at a time. Instead, they focus upon individual sounds, and individual sounds as they're represented by allophones in idea. It's a little helpful here to look at the way in which social evaluation rises in the system over time. And Silverstein's notion of indexicality is very useful here, been correlated, in fact, in a paper this morning, with my notion of indicator, marker, and stereotype. Indicator is the first thing we noticed in social linguistic studies, that particular sound types or morphophonemic types perhaps are associated with a particular group, and some people use it more than others. But they don't shift with styles, it's just a regular characteristic, and no one ever notices it. A social linguistic marker is a level 2 indexicality, where people begin to change styles, and in reading, in formal speech, they'll behave differently from casual speech. And when they're really excited, they'll move in a different direction. But still, with a marker, nobody knows it specifically or talks about it. The stereotype that I'm going to focus on today represents the strongest type of social evaluation, where people not only stratify in behavior and shift in styles, but also have ways of talking about it. And at least in North America, these ways of talking about it are pretty far from linguistic reality. They're mostly myths of various sorts. And I'm going to illustrate this by beginning with talking about 3 cities, stereotypes in Pittsburgh, and then in Philadelphia, then in Charleston, South Carolina, and then in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here's where Pittsburgh is located, right there where these green, the atlas shows these green spots in western Pennsylvania, is a city which is remarkable for its self-consciousness about dialect. The particular dialect we're going to talk about, stereotype we'll talk about here, is downtown. And this spelling occurs on T-shirts, in newspaper articles, everywhere. People are quite conscious of the fact that instead of downtown, people in Pittsburgh say downtown. And here is an example of a quotation from an atlas subject that we interviewed in 1995.
I went down there a few years ago. I don't get down there too often. I was like a kick from my time looking at the buildings. I never seen them buildings before. Now they got the tires, U.S. tires, U.S. Steel building. I don't get down too often. They say it's one of the prettiest views there is. You see the whole downtown before you cross the river.
Okay, so you notice that the ow monophthong is to ah before r and tires, as well as in downtown, but it's not an accident that he used this form in succession. because people in Pittsburgh are really aware of the stereotype.
I got a song here. It's a little Pittsburgh familiar. When Joe Brzezinski and the Clarks ain't around and you feel all alone. Downtown, you lost your reservations for B.E. Taylor's Christmas show. Downtown, go down to the Edison, the girls are really pretty. The 31st Street Pub serves up the coldest darn city, Mount Washington. They got a cool view up there. You can hop on an incline down to Station Square and go downtown. Kids can get exit.
Okay, so people have a lot of fun with downtown in Pittsburgh, and one of the questions we've raised is how accurate and realistic is the stereotype? Here is for the analysis of a vowel system, Henry K. 61 in the Atlas, and how the words are indicated by the square, the diamond with the arrows pointing up, and the ones that are highlighted down here are monophthongized. And you see there's the great majority of them. There's a few that are not. But it's an accurate description of his speech. And here is a map from Barbara Johnston's study et al., showing you the oldest speakers didn't show it at all, and then suddenly about 1900 it cropped up and has just begun to fall off a little bit for those born about 1950, 1970. So it's a legitimate change in progress, which is leveled off. But this diagram from Johnston's another paper of work with Scott Kiesling is very interesting. It shows you in each column the percentage of people who use this monophthongization of owl, as in, we bought a house. The left-hand column shows people who, listening to we bought a house and we bought a house, said they sound the same. And only a small number, 4 speakers said that. And most of them use this monophthongization themselves in speech. And the second column, there were 5 people who said they sound different, but it had nothing to do with Pittsburgh. And then there's only 2 people who said the diphthong sounded more Pittsburgh, that Pittsburghers say house. 25 people got it right. They said, yes, that house is the way Pittsburghers speak. But only 20% of them did it themselves. So to indicate there is a mismatch between social perception, which in a sense is accurate, and retreating from the stereotype. So people exaggerate the tendency, once the stereotype is invented, to do what the term itself suggests, apply it automatically. So let's contrast that with the structural consequence of Pittsburgh structure. And we'll talk about the Pittsburgh shift, the change shift. This is a map of the people in North America who show a merger of cot and caught, the lot and thought word classes. And there are 4 major areas. Eastern New England says cot and cot, don and don, hawk and hawk. And Canada and the West, and also Western Pennsylvania, separated from the others by Lake Erie, this other area spreading down into West Virginia. This is what results in most cases from this collapse, the Canadian shift. The lot class combines with the thought class, and then short A moves backwards toward short O, the trap class. The dress class moves down, and the kit class moves down, giving you this Canadian shift, which we find in the American West as well as in Canada. But there's another opportunity here. When short O moves up to join with lot, it leaves a hole, which in this case is filled by short A. But it's also possible for the Pittsburgh shit to jump in there, and the strut class of wedge moves down into this position where short A stays back and doesn't move forward. So this is a fork in the road to fill the hole that is created by the rounding and backing of short O. We get the lowering of wedge. And this shows you the mean values of 20 dialects in America, North America. Strut class PI, Pittsburgh, is lower than any others. We point to this point here. This is the a particular speaker who said, Henry Kay, the one we saw before, and let me play his pronunciation of the word duck.
Duck. Duck.
Most people hearing that think it is D-O-C-K. It's moved down into that area. And here is his son, who has the word duck back in this area. Now, nobody in Pittsburgh ever mentions or thinks about this. It is not a part of any discussion or any stereotype. It's totally unconscious. It's relatively new, but not that new because the man 61 years old chose it. It's a structural consequence, an opportunistic movement of wedge down into the short O position, which occurs as a structural consequence of the creation of the gap. Remember I said before that the short vowels form a subsystem, and when you remove one of those short vowels, there's a hole, and wedge drops into that hole unless short A moves forward into it. So it's an example of a structural consequence of sound change, which is totally unevaluated, not perceived, and seems to be uniform throughout the population. I'd like to turn to another city, Charleston, and relying upon not only the Atlas work, but a recent dissertation of Maciej Baranowski, who is at Manchester here, and a very fine study of the city of Charleston. Charleston, you see, is shown in the part of the American South. This red line defines the South as the area that shows a monophthongization of I, as in ha and wad. And the orange symbols represent people who have a high percentage of monophthongization of I, and the brown symbols show before over 60% in this area. But Charleston is only yellow, just like the North. You see these three yellow symbols for three speakers, just like the northern area. It does not participate in this. It has many other features where it's quite unique. And one of these is the fronting of long O, which we're going to look at. But first we have to go back to the original Charleston dialect. This is a recording I made myself of William McTeer in Beaufort, South Carolina, back in 1965. And this vowel system allows us to see that the A in this position and the O in that position are long, simple monophthongs ingliding.
Eat, sit, vote, God.
So here is the word lay with a spectrogram, and you can see how steady the monophthong is.
Lay.
Here is the word so.
So.
So that characteristic of the Charleston dialect is illustrated here again by Victoria G., a 90-year-old speaker studied by Baranowski. And we find that A and O have the same sound.
Skips, tape, coast, so.
So skates, tape, have that characteristic. Now, the origin of this ingliding long vowel has been attributed, and Baranowski documents, to the effect of the fact that the upper class speakers in Charleston drew nannies for their children from the Sea Island areas where the language spoken is quite distinct from African American English elsewhere, called Gullah or Geechee. And they have the same sound of E and O, and it was transferred to the children of the upper class and then spread to the community as a whole. Here is the O.
Good.
And here's an 80-year-old speaker from Charleston.
Go, go.
A 55-year-old speaker has moved the O fronter almost to center.
Go, go.
And a 16-year-old upper-class speaker, Pam, from Charleston, has...
Go, go.
This is from speak, though you'll hear even further in this word, toasts.
Toasts.
So that extreme fronting of the Charleston dialect represents the movement of a sound which is recognized, and it referred, there are stories about it, about the word 88, where the first person we saw, Victoria G., said that her brother had been a pilot in the Air Force, and he was flying a pilot coming into the airport, and they had a code number. Every plane had a code number, so to be sure the Japanese were not taking advantage of the sneak tacking their airports. And her brother came in and he said, "This is 88. And the people on the ground panicked. They didn't understand what he said, but they said, "It's a Jap. Close down the airport." So distinct is the Charleston dialect from the rest of the South. So it is a stereotype, but in this case, it's one that has been eliminated and moved in a direction which we indicate here. This arrow indicates the target. Now, the Charlestonians themselves say we no longer use this southern dialect, we speak northern. It's a common expression. Not only are we surrounded by northerners, but we have a northern sound. But actually, that fronting of O is not characteristic of the north. This diagram shows the atlas tracing that surrounds all those who have a F2 of O greater than 1200 hertz. That is, they have a centralized O. And the strongest ones are found not in the South itself, but in this region called the Midland. And the Columbus, Ohio is the closest to Charleston in this respect. Now here's a map showing you, or a chart, showing the fronting of U and the fronting of O in North American dialects, in 20 different dialects. Eastern New England is the most conservative. It has O and U in both vowels, conservative. These dialects front U but not O. The West, New York City, Canada, and the North more generally. Up here we see the typical characteristic use of vowels by older speakers over 65 years old in Charleston, upper class Charleston, and they have fronted U but very conservative O, which you heard, soul. Over here is the younger Charlestonians, just for those up to between 45 and 65, we have this spot, and here we get the fronting that you heard of toast and go, of youngest people in Charleston. So Charleston has abandoned the stereotyped pronunciation, and it's the upper class people who are leading it in both cases. What's unusual about Charleston is that the stereotype behavior is exemplified by the upper class, and the exemplified group leads the change away from it. But what direction they're moving is quite distinct from the social perception. They think of it as a northern speech, where in fact it is South Midland and distinct from the north. Now, another remarkable thing about Charleston is that near and square class, fear and fair, beer and bear, are merged in this traditional upper class dialect.
Fair, fair, bear, bear, bear.
This is from Baranowski's dissertation. And the people are rather conscious of this. It's not, unlike most mergers, it can reduce a social reaction. Here is Mark, age 23 years old.
Beer, beer. This is actually one that we talk about all the time. But yeah, me and my friend, I'd be like, "Give me that beer out the refrigerator." She'd be like, "You mean the beer?" I'll say, "No, beer. I want a beer out the refrigerator."
So the sound is a bit high here. And here we can see the rapid change This is a scale where 0 represents merged and 2 represents fully distinct, and age by decade shows that there's a regular logistic curve, a rapid decline of the merger and separation, which is startling and unusual, and leads the question, how is it possible for Charleston to do what no other city can do? And the domination of this linguistic situation by the upper class is a social linguistic factor we have to point to. But what's most interesting to me is something that is not mentioned or recognized or ever discussed by Charlestonians. It's the reorganization of the short A class. The short A or trap class is typically shown in the speech of that oldest McTeer as a continuous system in low front position in which there is some phonetic conditioning, but these squares represent words, back, bank, back, man, and the ones that are highlighted in heavy black are those before nasals. And there's no difference, as you can see, between the prenasal, like bank and man, and Savannah on the one hand, and mass and captain on the other. So that's the original Charleston system. If we move to a speaker 55 years old, an upper class speaker, we suddenly see a dramatic difference, whereas all the words which short A occurs before nasals are way up there in upper mid position, and all the words are down there. So you get camped and camping and bands and hands and hand and family and stand and demanding. Here's a younger speaker, again showing not as great a separation, but clean, non-overlapping distribution between short A words before nasals and all others. You notice this is what we call the nasal system, and it does exist elsewhere in the United States, as we'll see later on. The same area that Charleston has shifted to in imitation of the O class is the area in which this nasal system predominates. I'm going to move to Philadelphia now, the city that we studied most intensively recently. Here it is here. Let me get my cursor back. These three people are the three speakers from the Atlas study of Philadelphia. And it's part of an area we call the Mid-Atlantic States, which has many similarities but distinct from New York City, which is shown over here. Now those three speakers were only a quick glimpse. In the 1970s, we studied 102 speakers, and then year by year, Ling 560 class studied neighborhoods in Philadelphia, producing the Philadelphia Neighborhood Corpus. And of these thousands of interviews, we've recently transcribed 439 of them, and subjected them to analysis. These are the neighborhoods that have been studied in this series that represent the corpus that's put together. So the Philadelphia situation gives us the most intimate and closest opportunity to examine linguistic change in progress. Here's a chart showing you the year-by-year procedure and the age range of the people studied. And every year from 1972 up to 1992, and then every other year beyond that. And this is subjected to the FAVE program, which is a combination of two programs. FAVE Align takes as an input the sound and transcription of the text and outputs a prot text grid. And FAVE Extract is a second program that takes as input the sound of the text grid and outputs a complete analysis of the vowel system in one of two forms. Now this is the the website, and I've put the address, the URL, up at the top, faveling.pen edu. So it should be upenn edu. I'm sorry. That's a typographical error. It's faveling upenn edu. And this website allows anybody to use this program, and hundreds of people throughout the world have been using it feeding in their waveforms and the transcription and getting back the analysis of the vowel system. And it has transformed our approach to these topics because in the past, if we had a month or two to spare, we could do 1 or 2 speakers by hand, listening to them and using the Prof program or other programs to measure the vowels. But now, once it's transcribed, in an hour we can get not 300 or 400, but 10,000 vowels. So typically, this is the result for an individual speaker. This is Gene H., interviewed by Joe Freewold in 2006, 7,101 vowels plotted in the Plotnik program. Of course, by itself, this tells us nothing because it's just a pretty picture. But I wanted to use this vowel analysis for a moment to look at a stereotype. We're beginning with a stereotype of Philadelphia. And if you ask Philadelphians, what is Philadelphia dialect like, would they say water? Now, one word is used to indicate their recognition of the fact. And I'm going to play an example of the stereotype exemplified by Andrew P., who is a University of Pennsylvania freshman, interviewed quite recently.
I mean, like, my mom always gives me a really hard time and says I have a Philly accent because I say water. That's like the one thing I say that's like really a Philly accent. And like, she's like, I always give her a hard time back. I'm like, well, how are you supposed to say it? And she, my sister, like, it's water, water, with like a long A. And I'm like, no, it's water. And they always exaggerate my saying it and say that I say water. And I'm like, that's not what I do. I say it the right way.
Now, actually, you notice that you got confused there.
I like water. The way people say water in a Philadelphia accent, I like.
So, even though he was producing these stereotypes, he got confused just at the end and said the Philadelphia accent water. Now, what has happened here is that one word in particular has taken as a representative of a general fact. As shown here, these red dots represent all those dialects of North America in which the first formant of the thought class is lower than 700 hertz. That is, it's upper mid or high. And that extends from Providence, these 2 little dots here, through Connecticut, New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Wilmington. But except for these a few occasional spots back here, this belt of people are well recognized as a stereotype. And people in the West say, oh, the New Yorkers say talk. And this is symbolized in journalism by T-A-W-K. So A-W means awe as a popular stereotype. But here is what the FAVE program shows us about the distribution for 264 speakers, adult white speakers in Philadelphia. And the vertical axis represents this F1, and the 700 hertz line is right here. The horizontal axis is date of birth from 1888 to 1992. And the dotted line represents people with high school education or less, and the solid line is people with more than high school education, some college education. And you see this has been taken as a social linguistic variable almost from the very beginning, and that both groups are declining under the influence of water. Now, the one word water is signaled for the reason that in the rest of Pennsylvania there is a lexical shift. That one word is pronounced as with ah, not long open O, but as the lot class. But that has triggered off the social recognition. So people never say off, lost, talk, they say water. And if we look at Andrew P.'s actual production of them, we see that this is his stereotype up here, and this is the stereotype of the way people think that he says that we don't say it, and this is his actual range of production. Now he's a member of this group which has almost lowered long open O or thought class down to this point here. So that's the effect of the stereotype in lowering this event. It's had an effect upon the speech community, and it's perceived as this one word, water. Now, I'd like to contrast that with the unconscious change of sounds by Philadelphians. Looking at the two mid-vowels, A in pain and made, the face class, and O, the goat class, goat and hope. Now, these are never mentioned in actual discussions of Philadelphia dialect. The raising of A, in fact, was detected by us only quantitatively. Back in 1970, we were measuring vowels, and we discovered that the A in pain and made in syllables ending with a consonant was being raised. And here is what the FAVE analysis of the whole community shows from 1988 to 1992, 1888 1992. And we see there's a steady upward movement in which women are a bit ahead of men, as is usually the case in linguistic change. The dashed line is women, the solid line is men. But all members of the community participate in this, and Andrew does as well as everyone else, and all members of the sample who have high college education are indeed a little higher than others. By contrast, say, what we call EYF in may and pay and say in open syllables is practically flat. So the distance between these two was created early in the game and has continued on a steady line. So that's characteristic of a structural change which lies below the radar of social awareness. In contrast, to our great surprise, the fronting of O in go and OWC in goat is increasing in the same way. The solid line here represents the free vowel O, and the checked vowel goat is the dashed line. But somewhere around those born in 1950, it stopped and turned around and went back the other way. This reversal was the subject of our one of the topics discussed in our article. Now, going back to this same chart we saw before, the target of the Philadelphia correction of O is not down here, but up here. This is a northern pattern because this red line represents all those who are fronting O. Below that, they front O. Above it, you don't. And the target of the Philadelphia correction is a northern area. In fact, the sound changes that align Philadelphia with northern dialect patterns show continued change in the same direction across the century. And from this article we just published in 2013, we also state that sound changes that align Philadelphia with southern dialect patterns reverse starting with speakers born in the 1950s. So both Charleston and Philadelphia have altered their pronunciation of O, but Charleston, without realizing it, has moved in the direction of the southern dialects, and Philadelphia in the direction of northern dialects. I'd like to talk about the reorganization of short A, the topic which we saw in Charleston occurring below the level of recognition. Now, people do react to short A raising, and they say, oh, Camden. That's harsh nasal A in Camden. The sound of the tensed form is subject to social evaluation in Philadelphia, but not the question as to which words are tense and which words are lax. Now this chart shows you in brown all those who share the Philadelphia traditional distribution of tense and lax short A. The New York City system is quite different. So let me introduce you to it. It'll take a few minutes. But the The center of it is the same class that is important in British Broad A. Just we have France and Dance and Hoff and Bath and Lost. So we have front nasals and voiceless fricatives as the center of this process. Instead of leading to the lengthening in the back, it leads to the raising and fronting. Now, apparently the influence of British English was there at the beginning, because at the time that America was settled, father was pronounced father. And so the effect, the similarity in the Broad A system is to the Philadelphia system, and the New York City system is marked by this unnatural class of front nasals and voiceless fricatives. But in Philadelphia, it's all the words in M and N. So you can imagine a British saying ham for ham. It's unthinkable. It's only a subset of French loans and other words that lead to Broad A before M and N. But in Philadelphia, it's all words followed by M and N, as indicated here. But it's much more complicated than that. Before D, we get mad, bad, and glad. But sad, dad, frad, and all the words are lax. So you get some idea of how uniform that is. We'll look at this one speaker of the 7,101 tokens. And here is her words before D, before D. And here are the words, other words before D, which are lax. Now what words does she select? Bad, 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 glad, mad, bad, bad, glad, madly. As opposed to dad, dad, daddy, hadn't, sad, dad, dad, added, nads. So it's a perfectly uniform distribution, the traditional system, which is maintained right to the present. Now I didn't, recognizing the fact that there is social correction of stigmatized forms, we found that in our social subjective reaction tests that short A was evaluated negatively. And people who said bad were rated lower on a job suitability scale than people who said bad. Now, I expected that when people got a great deal of education and went to college and they became conscious of this and you asked them to read, they behave like New Yorkers. Here's an example of a New Yorker reading words designed to test this procedure, back from '62.
Boy, bad, but he was too fast. Only my aunt could catch him.
Let me play that again. I'm sorry, so loud.
We chased him with a baseball bat and yelled, bad boy, bad, but he was too fast. Only my aunt could catch him.
So we got the natural bad boy from New York, but we also got fast and then. And in relation to the long open O, or the thought class, this is the way she read a list of words.
Paul, all, ball, awful, coffee, office, chocolate.
So social correction became very uninteresting to me because it was a random pattern that gave us no insight into social structure. You couldn't guess what she would do with the next word. Well, Philadelphians who have been to college, particularly University of Pennsylvania, are frequently developing a pattern of negative reaction toward the Philadelphia dialect, similar to what all New Yorkers feel. A New Yorker, no matter whether they're working class or middle class or New York class, say, we shouldn't talk that way, it's terrible the way we talk. And there's a chapter on that in my book. Here is what Andrew P. has to say when he's talking about reading a list of words and encounters furry. In 1/3 of Philadelphians generally pronounce these the same. They say marry, marry differently, but furry and furry tend to be the same. Well, he didn't think of the same himself, but here's his reaction to this.
Very furry.
That's the way he reads it. And then he says,
the fact that these words on here are like, I mean, I'd imagine that fairy and furry are on there because in some instances they rhyme, and that's just absolutely disgusting. People who have really thick Philadelphia accents, they just bother me. Like, I don't know how people get to that. when I hear people say that, it hurts.
Okay, now Andrew is a great guy, and he's typical, though, of a small but increasing group of people who go to nationally oriented colleges. And I propose that their study of their speech would be uninteresting. Well, let's see. Here's a traditional Philadelphia split short A system. And to show you it's a little more complicated than what I showed before. In closed syllables, a is tensed, indicated by EH, before front voiceless fricatives, half, pass, math. Except zero onset polysyllables, aspirin, asterisk, or lax. Except learned words, alas, asp. Before front nasals, ham and fan. Except irregular verbs, ran, swam, began, and function words, am, an, and an. In three adjectives before D, which we saw before, mad, bad, and glad, and variably before L, though that's increasingly so pale in personality. Well, in order to produce, what's going to happen is that these Philadelphians, with their traditional system, required a negative attitude towards the dialect, and say bad and man and ad are ugly, have moved to a nasal system. I want to relate the nasals how you would do this. The first thing a nasal system does is to say, a before front voiceless fricatives is not going to be tense, only before nasals, so cross those out. Next, we're going to say, ran, swam, began are before nasals, so we'll cross out the fact that there are exceptions. And we don't need this other information here. So to convert the traditional Philadelphia short A system to the nasal system, if you want to behave like a Charlestonian, you have to do the following. You lax short A before all non-nasal consonants, like half, last, bath. But you also have to raise things. You raise before velar nasals and say bank, not bank, angle, not angle, angry, not angry. Before intervocalic nasals, you say Miami, not Miami, Spanish, not Spanish, hammer, not hammer. And you say I can, I am, I an, and. So a great deal of what you're doing is taking the stigmatized sound, so-called, and raising it to the stigmatized form in order to do this. Let's look at Andrew P.'s system, the very same person you're talking to. All of those triangles represent words before, that fall into the traditional tense class. And the ones that are highlighted are before nasals. There's only one exception, man is pronounced man. All the others are up here in the tense area. And there's, of the voiceless fricatives, there's one word that overlaps ass. All the rest are different. So that's pretty close to a perfect score. So what happened is that Andrew has reorganized the traditional Philadelphia system into the nasal system as a form of correction. Now here is what happens with his words which are traditionally lax. He has angry, just the way the traditional pattern is, but also angry. Danny, Miami, Miami, ankle, ran, began, hammer. So for those words, it's a remarkable performance because it says that social correction consists of moving the whole classes of words out of the area which was considered correct in the traditional system into what is considered the stigmatized form. To an idea that this is not characteristic of him, here's a short study we completed with college students from 2 Philadelphia high schools. This is the most elite high school in Philadelphia, in which you only get into if you have the very highest scores. And this one is a Roman Catholic high school, which is also college-oriented, Cahill School. And these are the colleges that they've gone to, Tulane, Yale, Penn, and Penn. And these are all Penn people except one at Temple. If we look at their performance with the A before M and N, we see that they've, with one exception, this person 8 out of 14, they're close to perfect. But the ones who come from Masterman are doing even better. 26 out of 26, 42 out of 42, 53 out of 54, 36 out of 42. If we take the traditionally tense words that are coming before a consonant, other than this is the half-past last class, they're practically perfect looking down the line, and a little bit of a scattering in this group. The traditionally lax words are raised 16 out of 16. These are the words like ankle and man, a very high percentage. Not so good at this school. So the Roman Catholic school is not doing the same. And the difference in their national oriented towards nationally recognized universities is quite clear. Now, what is this target area of the nasal system? The black dots represent dialects outside of Philadelphia which have the nasal system. And we can see that it's the same area that was the target in the short O, in the long O, in the Gao movement. It is in the, what we call the Midland area, the southern area. This is where the nasal system is predominant, but also found in New England. So in some way, these people in Philadelphia have sensed that the correct form is not a question of saying ah for air, but rather a reorganization which is characteristic of these regional dialects which are a target of their shift. So, as conclusion, we could say, although social stereotypes have limited relation to linguistic reality, perceptions of regional dialects can be accurate enough to produce consistent patterns towards or away from their basic phonological patterns. To my great surprise, Charlestonians, led by the upper class and university-oriented Philadelphians, have changed their traditional short A pattern by substituting new phonological rules, rather than altering the allophones of the targets of social evaluation. And more importantly, social factors can alter linguistic systems at a level more abstract than had previously been considered, creating a social stratification of phonological systems. This is a possibility I had not considered in the early studies of New York City. The notion is that even though social affect is directed towards allophones and stems, as indicated before, it's possible for speakers to recognize that other dialects have a separate system and do a massive correction, not of the individual sounds, but of the rule systems involved. Now, how general this is, I don't know, but it can't be an accident that it's happened in both Charleston and in Philadelphia. Both of them aiming at regional dialects, which are not in immediate contact, but recognized as having the characteristic standard of unmarked American English. The consequence of this work would indicate two things. First of all, we begin, like everybody, with the stereotypes. If you're studying a new town like York, first thing you do is look in the literature and see what people have said about it. The first thing that people say about it is a stereotype of some kind. Even the most perceptive observers who have not done actual interviewing in the community. And as you pursue this stereotype, you find that it is only a distant relationship to linguistic reality, and you get a more accurate description of the community. And then ultimately you may find that the community unconsciously is moving in a direction that makes sense linguistically and social linguistically at the same time, using the same linguistic capacity to alter structures and create linguistic rules of some generality. Thanks.
Right, Professor Labov has agreed to take questions. So, any questions?
Well, even though I've heard some of these things before, it just occurred to me that you've said that the Charlestonians are a little bit in error because they think they're aiming at a northern target, but in fact it's not northern. But it's north of them. How are they supposed to know what people are doing all the way up north? The target that they're aiming for, you say it's the Midlands, so they're wrong, quote unquote. But sorry, Jen, that's quite but I'm saying it's northern as far as they're concerned.
Well, that illustrates another stereotype which you'll find, unfortunately, in many British descriptions of American English. The standard idea is that we have the North, the South, and the general American, the West. Well, Hans Kurrat, in his atlas of linguistic atlas of the Atlantic states, so that wasn't so. His big discovery was to say it's not North and South, it's North, Midland, and South. The Midland is an area which is characterized by many morphosyntactic features of Scots-Irish speech, like needs washed and positive anymore. But it's also phonologically quite distinct from the South and doesn't share the monophthongization of I and then the other vowel system. So the West, then we get the extension of the boundaries we drew on the East towards the West shows that, but the social perception as of the American public is that there's North and South. So they don't have a vocabulary that can talk about the Midland. In fact, people talk about the Midwest is one of the vaguest areas of discourse you can imagine. And that goes back to the fact that people don't have a vocabulary to talk about language in general. Drawl, twang, guttural, that's about it. So that the discussion they have, they say, yeah, we sound like Northerners, can only use the vocabulary they have.
With respect to the near square merger or the reversal of that in Charleston, what kind of information do speakers need in order to be able to undo that, given God's principle and the irreversibility of mergers and all that? What kind of information?
Well, that's a good question, because Baranowski's dissertation wrestles with that and shows in some detail that there are a few words that were wandering loose. Spelling is not an infallible guide, as you see by the word beer and bear. So we had one principle that I've made much of, which is that mergers cannot be reversed by linguistic means, Tardy's principle. And this is a striking exception to that. And the only explanation that we can put forward is that Charleston is unique in having an upper class dialect leading linguistic change. I don't know of any other such case. So it's possible that this has given the social structure the guts to do it. But in Baranowski's dissertation, there's quite a few charts of individuals showing you a little variation here and there. By the time you get to younger people, though, it has succeeded. It's pretty uniform.
Any questions? I wonder if I could ask a question. You mentioned briefly, I think you said it wasn't dialect contact that was going on here. Is that what you said?
No.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, what you seem to have is a general American system that's fairly widespread. What is the knowledge that these people have? I mean, do they have stereotypes about these other places? Is it not contact then, or is it a stereotype that they have from somewhere else?
Well, I said to you before, I didn't think it was a case of dialect leveling, and that America differs from Britain in that the regional dialects are getting stronger. So the northern dialect is getting stronger, this Pittsburgh dialect is getting stronger, and that, but nevertheless, there is a perception of the unmarked broadcast standard. No question about that. And it takes different forms. What I want to show here is that though Charleston has lost its original city dialect, it has moved into a regional slot, not into the northern pattern as people thought. People say, well, where is General American if it exists somewhere? People would point to Iowa. And indeed, in our maps, Iowa is the least marked features of, but there's a northern Iowa and a southern Iowa. The southern Iowa is part of the Midland system. I think that what I used to think was an absolute difference between Britain and America is wrong. American regional dialects are getting stronger, and individual small dialects like Charleston have disappeared. Philadelphia and New York are doing fine. But the tendency, I think I've read a number of recent descriptions of Europe and Britain, is that the leveling is at a regional level. And I think that describes this, that our regions are inventing, the only difference I would say is that our regions are inventing new stuff. Sound changes that never exist, like the lowering of the strut vowel there, or the northern city shift, are new because they are not doing social operations upon previously existing entities, but following the linguistic logic of the system. That's characteristic of Canada and to a certain extent now new developments in the West. On the other hand, the South, as a whole, is receding in a way that would justify dialect leveling. It is generalized but retreating. So the younger you are in the South, the less likely you are to have the phonetic characteristics of the traditional system. In the North, it's the other way around.
So there is a kind of leveling.
Can you speak louder instead of having a private conversation?
So there is a sort of general leveling then, at the regional level. I mean, what you were saying was that, what you seem to be showing here is leveling towards a nasal pattern. So that's not a new thing, that's something that more and more dialects of American English are converging towards. The other thing is that I think the British dialectologists would say that there is leveling, but there's also part of the leveling is innovation at the same time, so that you get a certain spread of things outside Liverpool, for instance, which has innovations, and elsewhere as well. So, is it to do with population weight, number of people living in Philadelphia, which is very large, which then takes in all? If you're saying that that accent is still robust.
Remember, the difference between Charleston and Philadelphia that I showed you is who is doing the leveling. In Charleston, it's everybody. In Philadelphia, at present, it's only a small group of nationally oriented college people. But that may grow because that percentage of college people is growing all the time, and gentrification is increasing the contact between college people and traditional. The leveling effect that we see to the nasal system, we treat it as a default system. But what's so strange is that in the Western New York State in the 1825, the default system was to raise everything. And that created the people who today say, what happened? And that, and back, raising I before every word. And that in turn moved westward, developed this whole huge area in which vowels are rotating. So there were no black dots in the northern area, only in the Midland area. So far as the Midland and New England is concerned, the nasal system is a default system. And when I saw the pattern, the information to put in front of you, I was surprised as hell. I didn't know how people would figure that out. But then we went back into our data and we found that in the middle of New Jersey, some of our studies of small towns showed that families with parents from Philadelphia had kids with a nasal system. So at least in a third of the country, it's the default system, and maybe more.
So there is knowledge, there's access. This is Don's question, I suppose. So people have this knowledge, so that's how it comes from.
And I want you listening to American broadcasters, very careful speakers, I want you to just notice how often they say Spanish and banana. That's a sure sign of the nasal system, because the original pattern was you tense and close syllables, but in open syllables like that, you can hear this, and I think that that is a growing tendency in the country as a whole, but I can't prove it.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I was wondering whether the change you've observed came about consciously or unconsciously. For example, you state that the change has been led by the upper class and the university oriented Philadelphians. And so I'm asking whether that could be consciously done or unconsciously done.
Baranowski gives long discussion, quotations from his Charleston speakers. I quoted one of them about the story about 88. They're not linguists, and so they can't tell you what the word classes are that they're moving, but they're conscious of them, and the word it is a stereotype, but they also are aware of the fact that other words like state and are characteristic. So I'd say that the Charleston upper class is halfway between linguists and lay people. They talk, I think, more insightfully of the dialect, and they're conscious of this theory of the origin through the Gullah virus, and they know that they're different. So now we do have a study of the upper class in Philadelphia. Tony Kroc interviewed 20 members of the upper class, and they are different in many ways. They use a great many assertive adjectives. Actually, they are moderate followers of the traditional Philadelphia system. They showed no such tendency to innovate. They're not aware of that split between tense and lax, but they follow it in exact detail. Now, their children are beginning to change as a part of this educated group, but the older upper class are not as conscious of the linguistic issues as the upper class in Charleston. So I'd say there's a certain degree of consciousness of what the issues are.
Do we have any more questions? Peter?
Yeah, I wanted to try and ask a little bit more about possible structural factors here. So thinking back to the case of the Philadelphia freshman who's got this mixed system and then is adopting the nasal system. Is there any phonetic or phonological naturalness in that? So in other words, if somebody had a mixed system and they wanted to adopt something that was a simpler rule system, could they do the other way around? So could they raise before non-nasals and not raise before nasals? This is a question, I guess, for phonologists and phoneticians. So the question would be, is it clear that this is, in some sense, assimilation towards this Middle America variety, or is it, if you're going to make a change in the sound system, there are phonetically or phonologically more natural things and less natural things for one to do?
I put this back up while you're talking because it's the square is an unnatural class. And front nasals and voiceless fricatives don't have a simple description. And leaving ing out, now there is some logic in this. If you think of the tensing of short O before voiceless fricatives and nasals, which is very strong in America and is sort of disappearing in Britain, I think. We have cough, cloth, lost for voiceless fricatives. But with the nasals, it's the back nasal, strong, song, long. All common words long are tensed. So there is that sense in which the American system in the front vowels echoes a parallel process of the tensing of short O. But I think that if that is a default system, it does indicate the power of linguistic generalization. And I'd be inclined to say that I have no evidence that there's any awareness of the nasal system being widespread in the Midwest, as people think of it. But rather, it is the fact that it's a default system of simple, natural rules. But it forces you to do that strange thing they're talking about, which is to raise vowels that were considered to be unnatural. And it's interesting to see that people are not conscious of this. They say Miami without realizing it. So my money goes on the default system being a shift to the most natural rule system you can get.
Okay. I think it's time for us to say thank you very much to Bill for his excellent talk. Join us for some refreshment in physics building, which is, where is it? Where is it? No. Exhibition. Where, it's in the department. It's in the department, the linguistic department. Language and